Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar sponsored by Green Energy Consumers Alliance. And the topic for today is a Massachusetts climate policy update. Thank you for joining us. This is being recorded, and we will send out the recording and other materials probably by Monday or Tuesday. So I'm going to, if you can share my screen, I'm going to move on to the presentation. There you go. Here are the basics. You're muted throughout the webinar. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type those in. We'll get to those at the end. And the webinar is recorded, and we're going to send you an email Monday or Tuesday with the slides, but also some links to things that support what we're saying today. And if you'd like to use closed captions, click CC at the bottom of your screen. So who are we? Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization, 42 years old. We're based in Boston, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island, serving both states. And our mission is to empower consumers and communities to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. And the policies we're going to talk about today are hopefully going to put us in that direction even further. Today, presenting would be myself, and Anna Vanderspeck is our EV program director, but she's a bit under the weather today. So I'll do her slides on EVs. Amanda Barker is our Rhode Island policy advocate and our offshore wind expert. And Carrie Catan is our Massachusetts policy advocate, and we'll speak mostly about electricity and buildings. Today, we're going to talk about the legislative process and the bills that we're following. Then we're going to move on to what's happening in the executive branch and the agencies that can do regulations. What a lot of people tend to over-focus on sometimes is on legislation. It's awfully important, but there's the executive branch has authority that's been given to them by the Global Warming Solutions Act and other things that enable them to now take action with regulations. And there are some interesting things happening. And then we're going to talk about how you can engage in the process. As we say, policy and advocacy are not spectator sports. And so we're offering this session so that you can learn how you can help. And just a reminder, if you've been on our webinars before, we tend to present on three areas: electricity, buildings, and transportation. Those are the three big sectors in the Massachusetts economy that contribute to greenhouse gases. We'll start off with Carrie. Will start off about the legislative process and the bills that we're following.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So right now we are definitely in a busier time in the legislative session. Massachusetts has 2-year legislative sessions, and everything tends to happen in the second year, which has now begun. So in February 7th, the House took 5 climate bills from the Telecommunications, Utility, and Energy Committee. These are composite bills that have a lot of policies from a few different pieces of legislation that were before the committee and sent it to the next stage of the process, which is House Ways and Means. The Senate is expected to do something similar and also send either one bill or multiple climate bills to Senate Ways and Means, but they have not done that yet. We expect at some point in March and April for the climate bills to move from House Ways and Means to the full House. And in April, we expect, or thereabouts, we expect the Senate to put out its own climate bill. And then in May, the Senate's climate bill would have to move from Senate Ways and Means to the full Senate floor. And then in the later part of the spring and over the summer, the House and Senate conference committees will have to work out compromise bills between the two different pieces of climate legislation. And we expect them to be very different pieces of legislation this session. So there will definitely be a lot that will be decided in that conference committee. Next. So yeah, let's talk about the first big thing that we obviously need to get done if we're going to reduce emissions, which is having a good supply of clean electricity. So there is a lot about clean electricity. We're going to be talking specifically about the House climate bills that have moved to House Ways and Means at this point, just because that's where we have the most information and there's quite a lot to talk about. What I'm going to tell you now is, and what we're going to go over, is not a comprehensive look at these bills. They're 100 plus pages. This is just a highlight of some key features. So, with electricity policy, a big key feature is there's a lot of support for solar, from everything from changing permitting practices of how towns can regulate putting solar on your roof to trying to encourage more canopy solar over parking lots. And there's also a lot of support for storage because we obviously need to make sure that when the sun isn't when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, we can still be using clean electricity. So developing more storage is incredibly important, and legislation in here would encourage that. Another big clean energy policy that this does is it requires DOER, the Department of Energy Resources of the state, and the state's utilities to work together to procure long-term contracts for clean energy generation. These long-term contracts are important because they're for very large amounts of electricity and they're for long contracts. So if you are, say, an offshore wind developer, getting one of these procurements is great because you can have the confidence to go out and build a wind farm and know that you're going to have a customer who's going to pay a set price for that electricity. Or if you're, say, you want to build a power line between the hydroelectric dams in Quebec and Massachusetts to bring in electricity. Again, if you win one of these procurement contracts, you will have the certainty to make that financial outlay worth it. And both the power line from Hydro Quebec to Massachusetts and multiple of the states' offshore wind farms, including Vineyard Wind, which has gone along, and several that have not, have relied on these procurements. So this bill would set off another procurement that would not be specific to offshore wind. Instead, it could be won by solar, offshore winds, what are called Class 1 renewables built after 2019. It could also be won by other renewables built before 2019, as long as they have energy storage, hydroelectricity, or an existing nuclear power plant in New England. Um, that is at least the current rule set out for this procurement, proposed rules for this procurement schedule. Uh, yeah, next slide. Yeah, so on aggregation and retail competitive supply, it's kind of a mixed bag. So, for those who don't know, aggregation is when a town goes out and secures electricity wholesale, which they then sell on to their residents and businesses through long-term contracts. And aggregation is really great for several reasons. Towns can tend to work with companies to negotiate better rates than you can get from your utilities, so it can significantly save customers money. Aggregation programs can also give residents the option to buy extra clean electricity, which is great for obviously fighting climate change. And towns are allowed to sign contracts that can last years, whereas utilities are obligated to change their prices every 6 months. So you can provide a lot more certainty as to what electric rate customers are going to have to pay 2 years down the line if you live in a town with aggregation versus if you don't. So aggregation has been a very successful program overall. Unfortunately, in recent years, there's been a holdup with having towns that want to have aggregation programs. They've been prevented from doing so because the Department of Public Utilities, which regulates them, has been very slow to approve new aggregation plans. Fortunately, there is a lot of agreement that this needs to change. Both the House and the Senate have bills that would change aggregation rules and speed them up. And the Department of Public Utilities has also looked into taking action. So right now there is a docket 2367, which would change the rules and hopefully get more towns onto aggregation. So we expect in the next couple of months, we're either going to see the DPU fix the problem itself, or the legislature looks very willing to step in and make sure that the DPU fixes the issue. On competitive supply, it's a much more mixed bag and it's much more divided between the House and the Senate. So while aggregation is a town going out and buying electricity, retail competitive supply is when individuals do it. So you don't need to buy electricity directly from your utility or from your town. You can contract with an independent company. And this has tended to work really well if you are a large institution that can have lawyers look over your contract and make sure that you're getting a good deal. Competitive supply can be great. But if you are a individual that does not have a deep and thorough knowledge on electricity policy, on rate structures, on contract law, you're probably not going to sign a contract that is in your favor. And a lot of retail competitive suppliers know that, and it's basically become a cesspool of corruption for that reason. A lot of these companies that sell to residential customers engage in borderline fraudulent or straightforwardly illegal behavior, such as having people sign contracts in English when they don't speak English and can't understand what they're signing up dementia patients who obviously also can't really understand what they're agreeing to, giving people contracts with confusing terms that may mislead them. For instance, even I've received like letters being like, we will cut your electric bill down to this. And then you read the fine print on the second page, and it's like, that will be your rate for the next 3 months. And then we can increase it to whatever you want through something called a variable rate contract. And they have been caught also disproportionately targeting communities of color, low income folks, and communities where disproportionate numbers of people don't speak English, and they charge much higher rates than the electric utilities do or aggregation programs tend to do. So, because of all of this terrible behavior, there has been a big push to just ban residential competitive supply as an industry. And the Senate has a bill filed by Senator Creighton, 2106, which we expect to see move forward. The Senate has voted to ban residential competitive supply before in the past. Unfortunately, the House is much more against banning residential competitive supply, despite the issues and despite the fact both former Attorney General, now Governor Maura Healey, wants to ban competitive supply. Current AG Andrea Campbell wants to ban competitive supply. The mayor of Boston wants to ban residential competitive supply. The House thinks that the issues with residential competitive supply is a few bad apples, and through reforms and through passing Representative Chan's H3155, they can fix the issue. Well, H3155 would maybe solve some of the worst problems with competitive supply. In reality, a lot of that bill adds fines for things that are already illegal and in ways competitive suppliers already break the law, and it will not fundamentally fix the problem with the competitive supply market, which Green Energy Consumers believe, as an organization, believes can really only be solved by banning residential competitive supply. And yeah, and there's a final note on aggregation. The House bill will have Mass CEC working to connect aggregation programs to offshore wind. Next slide. Yeah. So another big thing that is in the House climate bills is interconnection and permitting. If we want to build out a lot of clean energy infrastructure, if we want to have more people heating their homes with heat pumps, using EVs, and having solar panels on their roof, we need to make sure that we have an electric grid capable of handling that. And our current electric grid wasn't designed to do that. So in order to fix this, there does need to be Representative Roy, who is the House Chair of the Telecommunications Utility and Energy Committee, has been very focused on changing interconnection and permitting rules. And there's a lot of changes in his proposed legislation that he sent to Ways and Means. So these permitting rules can vary a lot, from changing how towns can regulate rooftop solar to having it so that if you're a clean energy developer and you build a solar field, there would be more rules about how much electric companies could charge you in order to connect that solar field to the electric grid, and how fast they would have to move. There's also changes to permitting requirements in a variety of ways, really with an eye towards speeding it up and making things move faster. The best example of this is the House proposes creating a new agency that would handle the permitting of new electric grid infrastructure by bypassing a lot of existing permitting requirements. We know that's definitely been something that's been very close to Representative Roy, and that language act, a lot of it comes from a bill that he originally filed. But we also expect that to be an area of contention over the next several months, because while obviously there's advantages to building things relatively quickly, and we do need to build out the grid to a certain extent, there's also a lot of debate when it comes to, building substations in specific communities and building out the infrastructure we need. There's a reason we have a lot of permitting requirements, and it's to give a lot of community input. So finding a balance between building things quickly and getting the right amount of community input is definitely going to be a source of contention. Next slide. Okay, yeah, let's talk about buildings as well. So this is a lot faster than the electricity sector, just because the House is less focused on buildings. We expect a bit more in buildings, specifically on gas utility policy, when the Senate bill comes out, but it has pretty explicitly not been a focus of the House this session. But one big policy win that it's worth talking about is the House bills repeals Section 3 of the Gas Leaks Act. As background, the Gas Leaks Act was passed in 2014, and at the time, the state's goals were to get more people off of oil and propane and onto natural gas in order to save people money. But obviously now things have shifted. Now that the goal isn't to get people off oil and propane, it's to get people off all fossil fuels, including gas. Section 3 no longer makes sense, because Section 3 basically requires the Department of Public Utilities to help to approve new rate structures that help gas companies expand, which obviously would lead to more gas heated homes and more greenhouse gas emissions. And the Department of Public Utilities itself has pointed out that they cannot help the state meet its greenhouse gas emission reduction goals as they're required to if Section 3 remains on the books. So we definitely expect repealing Section 3 to have a good chance of making it through the Senate. It's really great to see it in the House bills, and we definitely hope that repealing Section 3 can make it into law. Next slide. Larry, you're muted.
Yes, now we'll turn it over to Amanda Barker to talk about offshore wind.
Great, thank you. So there's a lot that's been going on in the world of offshore wind. A very exciting development that happened at the end of last year was Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island announced a memorandum of understanding for a procurement of up to 6,800 megawatts of offshore wind, which is a really big procurement. And Massachusetts would be procuring 3,600 of those megawatts. And what this memorandum of understanding does is it basically creates a pathway where 2 or 3 of those states could jointly select projects. And so bids for this procurement are going to be due March 27th, and then they're expected to be selected in August. And so you may have heard about how inflation and supply chain issues have been causing, project contracts to be canceled or renegotiated. And the reason for this MOU is to really create a unified demand that will allow states to pool their resources, attract increased private sector investments, and then allow developers to scale up projects, bid larger projects, in order to be able to access economies of scale and bring down costs that way. So an example is if a developer has the capacity for a 3,000 megawatt project, they could bid at that full scale rather than having to bid, for example, within Rhode Island's request of just 1,200 megawatts. So, states can jointly procure larger projects, which will hopefully allow prices to decrease. Next slide. Okay. So this graphic shows all of the projects that are actually currently being constructed right now. The one that is contracted with Massachusetts is Vineyard Wind 1, and they actually very excitingly have started producing power to the electric grid. They have 5 turbines that are up and running. And then by the end of the year, they are expected to have all 62 turbines up and running. And will be producing enough power to power 400,000 homes in the Commonwealth. So that is very exciting that offshore wind is up and running in New England. South Fork Wind, which is contracted with Massachusetts, is also has some of their turbines producing power. And then Revolution Wind, which is contracted with Rhode Island, is beginning construction now. And Sunrise Wind is also under construction. Next slide. So we wanted to flag for everyone that there are some groups out there that have been spreading disinformation about offshore wind, which is essentially intentionally spreading false claims about offshore wind. And so we wanted to have this slide in here to make sure to remind everyone that you're being mindful of what you're hearing about offshore wind and being mindful of where that information is coming from. When we send these slides around, these links are all active resources that you can use that all kind of tackle the disinformation that has been occurring. The Against the Wind map was created by Brown's Climate Development Lab, Brown University. And it basically shows how think tanks in the anti-offshore wind movement have been receiving donations from fossil fuel interested donors since 2017. So it kind of shows the connection to the fossil fuel industry and some of this disinformation that's been happening. Real Offshore Wind is a great website that some oceanographers at the University of Rhode Island, as well as some climate professors at Brown University, put together, basically kind of going into some of the common frequently asked questions about offshore wind and dispelling some of the common claims against offshore wind. And then False Rumors in the Wind is just a great article in the New Bedford Light, kind of addressing some of the disinformation claims that have been made recently. And then the last link there is a webinar series that was put on by the New England for Offshore Wind Coalition, which is a regional coalition that we are a part of that basically advocates for the responsible development of offshore wind. And so they hosted 3 webinar series kind of going into depth on, the disinformation, where it's coming from, and how to best handle it and how to, have positive messaging around it. So if you're interested in learning more, I think all of those resources would be good to check out. Next slide.
Thank you, Amanda, and I'll take over now. Just a point on the disinformation. It's really a problem right now with that's unfairly targeting the offshore wind industry, but we're also seeing it with the same kind of interest. The oil and gas interest are sending disinformation about electric vehicles. We see that a lot, and also even buildings casting aspersions on heat pumps and new building codes that we'd like to see to reduce emissions in the building sector. So there's a lot at stake here as we try to make the transition from clean energy to from fossil fuels to clean energy, and it won't be easy. It requires people to make their own judgments, and we need to convey the right facts to legislators. So I'll talk a bit about transportation. Anna Vanderspeck is our resident EV expert, and she's just not feeling well today. But so, first of all, as Carrie indicated, the House has put out favorable recommendations on a number of bills, the Senate on different bills. But one thing we're watching is the House combined a number of EV bills into House Bill 3218, has provisions that would direct different state departments to work together to forecast EV charging demand. We think that's absolutely necessary. It kind of drives us crazy that the utilities and other state agencies are all making up their own forecast, and they ought to be on the same page. And so we think that's a positive development. It would also extend rebates for buying a car or leasing a car in Massachusetts through the end of 2027. So there's some money there for that. And there are public charging stations that you can go to, but just like gasoline pumps, they need to be inspected to make sure that if you're buying 5 kilowatt hours of electricity, you're getting 5 kilowatt hours of electricity. And so it enables the Division of Standards to do that. Creates a statewide right to charge rule, directs municipalities to streamline permitting process for charging stations, and creates a fine for blocking an EV charging station with a gasoline powered car. Those of us who have EVs will find that occasionally, and it's pretty annoying, and there ought to be something to help prevent that. So then move on to the next slide. There are other House and Senate bills. There was one that we wrote, or Anna did, that would fund EV rebates with a new fee on expensive gasoline-powered cars, particularly heavy ones. The ones that tend to cost the most money are generally the heaviest ones with the worst gas mileage. That did not make it through the House or the Senate. A bill, again, that Anna wrote was to require the utilities to offer rebates for charging off-peak that would account for all the benefits that the electric system gets when someone charges off-peak rather than on-peak. That was reported out favorably in the Senate. It was not in the House, and so we're going to be hoping to persuade House members to support the Senate version when they get together in conference. A couple of bills that were reported out favorably in both chambers. One was to have a bit of a schedule for electrification of commuter rail. Right now, a lot of commuter rail is still run on dirty diesel fuel. We'd much prefer to see that electrified. And then to electrify public and private fleets, that was also reported out favorably. So those are bills that we're feeling pretty good about. When they've been reported out favorably in both chambers, you can have a pretty amount of confidence that they will make it through to the end. A bill that did not make it was setting out a schedule for electrifying regional transit authorities. Most people think of the MBTA. That's the largest regional transit authorities, but they're scattered around the entire state. And we'd like to see them all move towards electric buses. There was a funding and a statewide contract for electric school buses. That didn't make it either. So I guess we're saying pay attention to the ones that were reported out favorably. Environmental justice is an important issue for Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We're supportive of a lot of organizations that would be on the front lines of these issues, communities where they're predominantly people of color, low-income folks, tend to have borne the brunt of the energy system in the past. We want to see, as we move towards clean energy, that it's fairer and better to everybody. So there are a couple of bills that we're watching. One is the siting of energy infrastructure. We're part of a group called the Mass EJ Table, Environmental Justice Table, that meets, and we've endorsed a bill, House Bill 3187. The House siting bill is significantly different from that. But we're waiting for, the governor has a commission on siting and permitting that is going to be working in the next few months. And we think that once that report is out, that will help the House and the Senate settle on what policies are needed to site that energy infrastructure in the way that Carrie described, balancing the fact that we do need more wind turbines, we need more solar panels, we need to site storage. And if we're going to electrify EVs and heat pumps, it's a reality that the utilities are going to have to build more substations, which is not something we've thought about much over the last few years, but as demand grows, because we're shifting from oil and gas over to electricity, those stations will have to be built, or at least improved. Another bill that we're watching is to improve air quality. And that is, looks like it's working its way through the Public Health Committee of the legislature, but we haven't seen a redraft. But that's a bill that would take into account cumulative impacts over time. Now moving a whole new section now off legislation, more towards executive branch and regulatory topics. Just want to put out there that pretty hot off the press, the Healey-Driscoll administration released the Massachusetts' first ever environmental justice strategy. It's really not a set of regulations, but it's certainly executive branch action. They put a lot of time and effort looking across all the state agencies about how they can play a role in supporting environmental justice. And so that's something you may want to look at. We'll send that along, the link to that report when we're sending you the email. A bill that we mentioned, actually a regulatory proceeding, we believe that it's important that electricity in general, but particularly for electric vehicles, be charged based upon the time of use. A reality is that 10% of the hours in a year amount for about 40% of the cost to the system. Those are the peak demand issues, particularly in the summer when it's really hot, 95 degrees, everyone's got air conditioners going. That's not a good time to be charging your electric car if you can avoid it. Fortunately, it's a very easy time to shift your charging of your car to an off-peak time period. And so there is a docket that we're part of that would discuss this issue, and we're there in the docket as an intervener to make the case that there are multiple advantages to shifting the load of EVs to off-peak times. We're kind of convinced that the technology's there and that the time is right. It's one of the most important things in grid modernization, but policy is just moving a bit too slowly. So we're hoping that that proceeding will result in something beneficial. Related to that, last year's climate bill created an electric vehicle infrastructure coordinating council. We're not on it, but Anna goes to all the meetings and has been contributing her comments. They released their initial report in August. Then they worked to allocate $50 million in federal ARPA funds to provide charging access to segments that have been difficult to electrify. And in particular, we're talking about multi-unit dwellings, medium and heavy duty fleets, ride for hire, which means Uber and Lyft, that sort of thing. And also supporting that division of standards that we mentioned so that they could test and make sure these things are working well. So we are hoping that this council will continue over time to help guide the manner in which we build out EV infrastructure. What I like about it is that it's taking it from a statewide perspective in the public interest, and it's not just reacting to what the utilities are proposing when it's convenient for the utilities. And now I will turn back over to Carrie for a bit to talk about a couple of other issues.
Yes. Yes. Speaking of regulatory affairs, in a very important case that came came out of the Department of Public Utilities that wrapped up in December. The DPU put out a final order on the 2080 docket, sometimes called the future of gas, sometimes called the future without gas. And basically, 2080 came about because then Attorney General Maura Healey went to the DPU and said the state has greenhouse gas emission reduction laws. Utilities need to figure out a way to comply with them. You, DPU, need to open up a docket to tell the utilities how to comply with this. So this was a byproduct of several years of work and definitely was very impacted by the fact that two of the DPU commissioners are new and appointed by Maura Healey. So the docket over the course of its life definitely changed from one where it kind of looked like the gas utilities were going to get what they wanted, which was a plan to decarbonize the gas system by switching out regular fossil gas with renewable natural gas and hydrogen, which, for reasons that it's too complicated to get into, but involve both cost and safety, it was a completely unfeasible idea. And the DPU ended up coming out with a final order that really sided with what environmentalists wanted, which was amazing, which basically said renewable natural gas is too expensive for gas companies to make regular residential ratepayers pay for it. Gas companies need to come up with plans that don't involve its use to meet their greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And we need to be thinking seriously about how we are going to reduce the number of gas heated homes and reduce the size of the gas system for the state to meet its greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And this is a big deal because the DPU has never directly said anything like that before. And the department pointed out one area, repealing Section 3, which I brought up earlier, that they explicitly said needs to be changed in state law for them to help the state meet its emission reduction goals. So this docket is definitely a big deal. And if we can follow it up with legislative action to change laws around gas utilities this session, this could be a great way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the Commonwealth. Next slide. Yeah, and speaking of the DPU, they also have an energy affordability docket. That this one is not concluded. It is still open. It is, in fact, only recently begun, so it will probably be going on for a while. So what the department is looking at is basically how can they make energy more affordable for low-income folks. Right now, low-income customers can get a low-income discount rate, but the DPU is interested in ideas that could kind of go beyond that. So one is they're talking about doing multiple tiered discount rates. So if you're very low income, you could get 55% off of your electric bill rather than 10%. And if you make a bit more, maybe it's 30% off your electric bill. Another option is to do a percentage of income payment plan, and that would basically tie someone's electric rate to how much they make. So, if you make $30,000 a year, the DPU could say okay, your electric rate is going to be 6% of that $30,000, and it cannot rise above that. And that could be a way to help low-income customers be able to afford their bills every year. So this energy affordability docket is very much a work in progress. Next.
Thank you, Carrie. I'll take it from here. We're in the home stretch and we will be taking questions. So now an issue that we're involved with is grid modernization. Last year's climate bill that passed was actually 2 years ago. The legislature set up required utilities to submit electric sector modernization plans to a new commission, the Grid Modernization Advisory Council. And they did that. I happen to be on the Grid Modernization Advisory Council representing low and moderate income ratepayers. They submitted a draft plan to us in September. And our job is totally advisory, was to provide recommendations back to the utilities on how they could write a final report. We did that. And then on January 29th of 2024, the utilities wrote their final reports to the Department of Public Utilities. Those plans, the electric sector modernization plans, are now dockets, and meaning each one, National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil, all the investor-owned utilities that are subject to regulation, will have their plans approved by the DPU or modified by the DPU or rejected by, according to law, August of 2024. And you can get details on their plans and the recommendations of the Grid Mod Advisory Council at that site. But what this gets at, this whole purpose of this is to try to get the utilities to make smart investments so that we can have a grid that's able to accommodate a lot more solar power, a lot more storage, EVs, and heat pumps. As it turns out, there will have to be a significant amount of new investment into the grid, but we want to make sure that it is at the proper pace. It's not too fast, because that will cost more money than we need. We want to make sure it goes into the right locations. A lot of it is time and space dependent. So it's not as if the entire state needs upgrades all over the place. There are pockets where the grid needs more attention than others. And so we're encouraging the DPU to look at these proposals with a very fine eye and to ask a lot of questions. And we're intervening in this docket, and we're asking our own questions of the utilities to try to get more information about what it is that they're really trying to do. There's a clean heat standard policy that we've been promoting very heavily. What that does is it obligates sellers of natural gas, heating oil, and propane to earn clean heat credits. They need to support getting the shift away from fossil fuels to primarily heat pumps. The DEP, the Mass Department of Environmental Protection, is working on that policy. We're very happy to see that. They're going kind of slow, though, and we would like to see them move along. We've made some recommendations to them how they could make their first draft framework into something that would be better. But as it turns out, there are community meetings on that next week. We'll send you more information about that. We are so supportive of the clean heat standard that we actually filed a bill, House Bill 3694, sponsored by Representative Driscoll, that would create a clean heat standard. That was not recommended by the Energy Committee, but we're glad to see that the Healy administration knows that it needs to be done. In our viewpoint, it's not possible for the state to meet its climate goals without a clean heat standard. It's not the only bill that can help reduce emissions from the building sector, but we think it's one of the most important. There is another policy that the Department of Environmental Protection is pursuing, and we're happy that they are. It's to strengthen the clean energy standard, which requires electricity suppliers to gradually increase the percent of clean energy resources such as wind, solar, small hydro, and large hydro. It's been in existence, but the ramp up every year is too slow. They're talking about making some changes that would pretty quickly add another 5% requirements of clean heat, of clean electricity. And there's information at that site right there. It's one of those things that's not getting the attention it deserves. As an organization, we tend to try to focus on things that would make the most difference at moving the needle, as we say, reducing greenhouse gases. And this regulation would do that, just like the clean heat standard, in a different way. Closing thoughts. The House and the Senate are most aligned on transportation and clean electricity policy, I would say. Where there's a big difference, Carrie explained, was how to deal with retail electricity supply. The House has one view that we don't support. The Senate has a view that we do support. And they will be trying to reconcile their differences when they get to conference committee. I think both chambers could do better on building decarbonization. bills having to do that. The Senate's a little bit further along in that thinking, kind of focused more on the gas industry than the House. And I would say that the House is focused more on that siting bill that Carrie referred to. The Senate's more focused on gas policy, I think. And both of them are kind of more focused on EVs and clean electricity. And again, just a reminder, we're talking about major issues that are being addressed in the executive branch as well. So how can you engage? Several state agencies are asking for input. We will send these slides to you, but we've written a blog that lists all of the opportunities in the next month where you can tell a state agency, whether it's the Department of Energy Resources or the DPU or another agency, about a particular issue. We describe those in the blog. You can go to our website, greenenergyconsumers.org, look for our blog page, and if you subscribe to the blog, every time we write a blog, you'll get that in your email. We recommend that you call or email your legislator. If you can't, go to the Massachusetts legislature webpage, and there's a place where you can search and find your legislator. And again, we'll send the email out to you by Monday or Tuesday. We have a lot of upcoming events that you can see at our events page, greenenergyconsumers.org events. And then we are a private nonprofit, and we would benefit greatly if you could make us a contribution that would be tax deductible if you itemize charitable deductions. Starting tomorrow, March 1st, if you donate any day in March, you can double your donation because a generous donor has offered to match donations that we receive in March. And so we hope that you would, and appreciate the fact that you're here today. Now we'll get into some questions. Judith asks, is network geothermal now available for any town to implement? I will start and then turn it over to Carrie. Not in every town. There's 3 years ago, the legislature asked the utilities to come up with pilot programs for network geothermal. National Grid is building one right now in Lowell. Eversource is building one right now in Framingham. And we know that the legislature is interested in supporting further development. And I think that issue is addressed and maybe likely to be addressed in a bill that the Senate seems in favor of, that Carrie can speak to in a minute. It's also, I think, going to be addressed by, Carrie pointed out, the DPU came out with an order on that docket 20-80. So the DPU may start requiring the utilities to push in that direction. And then finally, I would say the clean heat standard policy that we're talking about will be a major boon to electrification, whether it's air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, or network geothermal. It will help provide incentives for suppliers to look at different ways, including network geothermal. But Carrie, do you want to perhaps talk about either the Senate Future Clean Heat Bill or 20-80?
Yeah, so I guess to start off, there is some language in the House bills that would make it slightly more easier for gas companies to have network geothermal projects without having them to be explicitly approved pilot programs. But that language isn't a big change. We definitely need more comprehensive language to do a few things. Like, we need to allow gas companies to sell heat through ways other than providing gas outside of pilot programs. We need to change the laws around how they're obligated to sell people gas. There's definitely a lot of changes that need to be happened before we can start seeing gas utilities rolling out network geothermal systems more widely. That would probably come out of the Senate bills, or at least hoping. We know that there is a lot of interest in taking from the Future of Clean Heat bill, which is a bill that is very in support of turning gas homes to electrification, often through network geothermal systems. And there's interest in that bill in the Senate. So hopefully we will see more of that. And there's definitely also a lot of interest in network geothermal systems in the Department of Public Utilities. I suspect from reading what the department has put out on the gas system that as long as the network geothermal pilot programs that are currently happening give good results, and as long as the laws are changed around making sure that network geothermal can be put out in more areas, the Department of Public Utilities would probably very much push gas companies to switch over their customers to some form of electrification, which could definitely include network geo.
Yeah, and oftentimes we're talking about the major utilities in Massachusetts, which are National Grid and Eversource and Unitil. They for electricity, they're about 85% of the customers in Massachusetts. But when we talk about, but there are also about 40 cities and towns that are served by municipal utilities, and those are not subject so much to DPU regulation. So when you think about any of these issues, those cities or towns could move ahead forward if they wanted to, without having to have the same kind of process with the DPU. John asked, do we know why electrification of school buses didn't make it out of committee? Anna Vanderspeck is our expert on electric school buses. She's working on a project to try to address the barriers that are in the way of adoption at wide scale for that. And I would say, I believe the answer is that the legislature was focused more on the other issues that we've talked about. And I think there's still some question about how we're going to finance the electrification of school buses, the capital cost, and then also the charging infrastructure that they would require. And then there's some other barriers. A lot of school buses are contracted out by a city or town. They're not owned by the city or town. To me, these are all things that we have to overcome in the next few years, but I suspect the legislature just was not able to get to it this year, but certainly I will bet that a lot of the issues that you might be interested in that didn't make it through this year, I think might be up for grabs in 2025. I have a feeling we're going to see a climate bill, if not every year, every other year, because there's always more to do. Then Judith talks about that she sees National Grid continuing to install yellow pipes to carry methane gas and hydrogen mixed. Well, we do know that the utilities would like to put hydrogen into the pipelines. We are pretty confident that the DPU and the Healy administration will prevent that from happening. So they're installing new pipes or replacing old pipes. We're really not too fearful of hydrogen getting into them. They're also pushing, the utilities are pushing renewable natural gas, which we think is an expensive and wasteful use of that resource. So we'll oppose that as well. You're leading to another point, which is one of the questions that a lot of people are asking is, rather than spending a lot of money to continue to replace old gas pipes, can we sort of switch communities and neighborhoods to things like network geothermal and air source heat pumps? I think that's what that future of gas, or the future without gas, is all about. John asked, what's meant by the term docket? I did use that a few times. That is a term of art in the Department of Public Utilities. When the utilities propose something of any nature, they want to build more charging stations for EVs, or they want to raise our rates, or they want to file their electric sector modernization plans, they're often given a docket number, and that's treated almost like a court case. It's very much the lawyers are involved, and so, for example, 24-10 is Eversource's electric sector modernization plan. 24-11 is National Grid's, and 24-12 is Unitil's. And so that's just a way of keeping them separate and tracking the process. Then another person asked, what towns are focused on expanding EV charging and or shifting the load of EV charging to off-peak times? That is a matter more at a state level. Cities and towns can play a role. Recently there's some discussion in the Boston City Council about trying to improve access to EV charging in Boston. But overall, we need charging all over the state. And that, again, is what the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Coordinating Council is all about. The DPU oversees programs that the utilities have, National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil, to build new charging stations. Again, they're looking to make sure that every part of the state is covered. The utilities that we just mentioned, the investor-owned utilities, are looking at encouraging charging to off-peak. We don't think they're moving fast enough in that area. That's not something that a city or town would take on so much, except for the municipal utilities can, and some are very much encouraging people who have EVs to shift off-peak. But most of the population is supported by Eversource, National Grid, or Unitil. And Judith says, great session, thank you. And we would say you're welcome. And we're coming up at 12:59. If anybody has any further questions, we'll take them now. I wasn't sure we would get that done in 1 hour, but perhaps we did. Well, we'll call it a day, and everybody, please enjoy. It's a very windy and sunny day, so that's good for renewable energy production. Thank you. Bye-bye.